Twilight Struggle. The Cold War, 1945 to 1989, is a card-driven strategy game for two players, with its theme taken from the Cold War. One player plays the United States, and the other plays the Soviet Union. The game takes its title from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle. Twilight Struggle was the highest-ranked game of all time on Board Game Geek from December 2010 to January 2016. Gameplay. The victory point system in Twilight Struggle uses only one victory point track and one victory point marker for both the US and the USSR. The track extends from -20 to 20, and the victory point marker starts in the middle at 0. The goal for each player is to have the victory point marker reach their extreme on the track, or by having the victory point marker on their side of the track at the end of the 10 turns. A player can also win the game by having control of Europe when the Europe scoring card is played. Additionally, either player can also lose the game by having a nuclear war start during their phase. The 103 cards in the game have two main features: events and in-operation points value. Each card can generally only be played for one or the other effect, not both. A player is required to play at least one event each turn. The operation points value allows the player to either place influence in one or more countries, attempt a coup in a country, attempt to realign the status of a country, or advance the superpower's position in the space race. The events represent a specific historical event, such as the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Berlin Blockade, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or might stand for a more general situation such as a nuclear test ban, anti-war protests, or a dominant performance at the Olympic Games. Events will help either the USA or the USSR, or in some cases both. Unlike many other card-driven games, if a player plays a card with an event associated with the opponent for anything other than the space race, the event occurs for the other superpower, so a player may be forced to help his opponent in order to help himself. By contrast, only if a card shows an event favoring the phasing player does he have a free choice as to whether to trigger the event or play for the operations points. The cards in the game are separated into three categories: early, middle, and late war. Only early war cards are dealt out in the first few turns. Later on, the middle and then the late cards are shuffled into the draw pile. This organizes the historical events into a general timeline, so that the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact is likely to happen several turns before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which usually happens before Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech, but the specific order will vary from game to game. Sometimes even these general timelines will change, because players may use an early war card as operations instead of as an event, only to have the card resurface late in the game. Influence is used to align countries to favor one superpower or the other. Each country has a number that represents the country's stability, and a player must have this many more influence points in the country to control it. For example, India has a stability of 3, so if the USA player has 2 influence points and the USSR has 5, the USSR controls India. But if the numbers were 2 and 4, the difference would be less than 3 and neither player would control India. Influence may only be placed in or adjacent to countries in which a player had influence at the start of the action round, and costs double to place in a country already controlled by the enemy player. A country with a high stability number is also less vulnerable to coups. Coups and realignments serve to reduce the opponent's influence in an area. A realignment roll allows a player to roll to reduce enemy influence in states, and is more likely to succeed if the friendly player has influence in the state in question, or controls adjacent states, or if the state is adjacent to a superpower. Coups are usually more effective, and may enable a player to regain a foothold in a continent where his opponent is threatening to gain complete domination, as they need not take place in or adjacent to a country where the player has influence already. And a very successful coup may enable the player to place influence of his own. However, supporting a coup in certain key battleground states will increase nuclear tensions and lower the DEFCON level by 1. Both players must also keep a watch on the DEFCON level, which will be lowered by coups in certain events. Should a play be made that drops DEFCON to 1, it ends the game with a nuclear release, with the player whose phase it is losing the game. Under very rare circumstances, a player may therefore win the game by starting a nuclear war during his opponent's phase. As DEFCON drops, coups and realignments are forbidden in certain parts of the map. They will become unlikely in Europe and Asia, for example, while still remaining possible in less stable regions such as Africa and Latin America. DEFCON automatically improves by 1 at the end of each turn, so will naturally rise back to 5 if neither player does anything to reduce it. A final twist is that each player is required to conduct a certain number of military operations each turn, equal to the DEFCON level, or else forfeit VPs. This can be satisfied by playing war events if he has any in his hand, but the extra must be made up by coups. The Vietnam War is portrayed slightly differently, as a game event requiring the US player to discard a card each turn, effectively paralyzing him until he successfully rolls a die for it to end. A similar card portrays the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The game is strictly for 2 players, with all other countries being shown firmly as satellites of one or other superpower, or else uncontrolled. The game's designer notes explain that this represents the internal logic of the Cold War mentality, even when that logic is now known to be flawed, in order to put the players in the mindset of the historical participants. This applies even to lesser world powers such as Britain and France. For example, the idiosyncratic foreign policy of General Charles de Gaulle is shown simply as a card event increasing Soviet influence in France. The only exception is China, which is not shown as a country to be controlled on the map, but rather as a card, with a high ops value. The China card is not drawn normally, but starts in Soviet hands, and after use by either player is passed to the other player for use in subsequent turns, representing China tilting from one block to the other. A player also receives a VP for holding the China card at the end of the game. Having enough influence to control a country does not instantly score VP, but contributes toward points scored for presence, domination, or control of an entire region, which will score VP when that region's scoring card is played. A region's scoring card may be drawn and played several times throughout the game. During scoring, additional points are also scored for the number of battleground states controlled in the relevant region, and further points for states adjacent to the enemy superpower. Control of Europe during a scoring causes the relevant player to win the game outright. There is also a single scoring card for Southeast Asia, which will most likely be drawn sometime in the mid-game, corresponding to the time of the real Vietnam War. Advancing along the space race towards a moon landing will also periodically score VP. Some events will also score VP. The opening turns will generally see a great deal of jockeying for position in Europe, Asia and the Middle East, spreading to other regions such as Africa and South and Central America in later decades. The scoring cards for the latter regions do not appear until the mid-war deck is added. The game generally shows a slight tilt to the USSR in the early turns, as events in Asia will generally lead to an expansion of Soviet influence in that region. Late war events, such as Chernobyl, the Iron Lady, Tear Down This Wall, and Solidarity, helped the USA to expand its influence in Europe. especially the key battleground state of Poland, and the unrest in Soviet-aligned Eastern Europe becomes more severe as well. This is counterbalanced by a few powerful events, most notably the espionage of Aldrich Ames for the USSR. Reception. ZEV Schlesinger comments that Twilight Struggle gives you a compact history lesson about the Cold War, nicely encapsulating the struggle between the two superpowers and those caught between them. Coupled with that is the game's accessibility and the design's cleverness, all of which make Twilight Struggle stand out among the crowd of recent political wargame releases. Awards. Twilight Struggle won the 2005 Charles S. Roberts Award for Best Modern Era Board Game, and the 2006 International Gamers Award for Best Wargame and Best Two-Player Game. It was the first game ever to win 2 International Gamers Awards. Twilight Struggle also received a 2006 nomination for the Diana Jones Award for Excellence in Gaming. In 2007, the game received a nomination from Games Magazine for Best Historical Simulation.